Have a wonderful day. Enjoy the story. Sophie Evans's life was marked by tragedy and heartbreak from a young age, shaping her into the innocent yet strong-willed girl she had become. At just 15 years old, her world shattered in a single moment when her parents were killed in a horrific car accident. She still remembered that day with haunting clarity, the way the police officer's face turned grave as he knocked on the door, the quiet sobs of the neighbors, and the chilling realization that her life would never be the same again. Sophie was left alone in the world, vulnerable and broken with no one to lean on except her uncle and aunt, Robert and Margaret, who reluctantly took her in. From the beginning, Sophie could sense their resentment. They treated her like a burden rather than family, constantly reminding her of the inconvenience she had become. Though Sophie was naturally gentle and kind-hearted, their coldness made her feel like an outsider in her own home. She would spend hours in her small room, brushing her long braided hair and looking out the window, wondering what her life might have been like if her parents were still alive. Sophie grew into a breathtakingly beautiful young woman. Her brown skin glowed with natural radiance, her wide, expressive eyes capable of conveying every flicker of emotion, framed perfectly by thick, clear brows. Her beauty was undeniable, but it became both a blessing and a curse. Robert and Margaret saw her growing beauty, not as a gift, but as an opportunity, a tool they could use to secure their own financial future. When Sophie turned 22, the whispers began. Her aunt and uncle would speak in hushed tones late at night, their voices laced with greed and calculation. Sophie didn't fully understand what was happening, until one day they sat her down in the cold, dimly lit dining room, with somber expressions. "Sophie," Robert began, his tone devoid of warmth, "we've made a decision for you. You're going to marry James Harrington." Sophie's heart stopped mid-beat, her wide eyes filling with terror. "What?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "James Harrington is a billionaire," Margaret added with a twisted smile. "He's agreed to marry you in exchange for helping us with some financial troubles." Sophie's stomach lurched violently. James Harrington, the name was well known in the city. He was a powerful 50-year-old businessman, feared and respected by everyone. His fortune was built on ruthless business deals, and his face had been splashed across countless financial magazines. But more than that, he was old. He was more than twice Sophie's age. The thought of being married off to a man so much older than her, someone she didn't know and had never spoken to, made her feel sick. "No," Sophie said, shaking her head in disbelief. "You can't make me do this." But Robert's expression turned hard. "We can, and we have," he said coldly. "Do you think we've been supporting you all these years for nothing? It's time you give something back." Sophie's heart pounded violently in her chest, tears burning her eyes. "Please," she begged, her voice cracking. "I don't want this. He's too old for me. I can't marry him." But Margaret's expression remained as cold as stone. "You don't have a choice," she said with a sneer. "The wedding is in 2 weeks." Sophie ran to her room, collapsing onto the bed as sobs racked her body. Her mind raced, trying to find a way out, but there was none. Her uncle and aunt held complete control over her life. The days passed in a blur of dread and helplessness. Sophie couldn't eat or sleep properly, her once glowing face becoming pale and drawn. She felt like a prisoner, locked in a fate she couldn't escape. She imagined James Harrington, imagined him as a cold, cruel man who would treat her like a possession rather than a person. The thought of being forced to share a life, a bed, with someone so much older than her, made her chest tighten with fear. On the day of the wedding, Sophie felt like she was walking toward her own execution. Dressed in a breathtaking white gown that hugged her slender figure, she looked like a goddess, but inside, she felt like a hollow shell. Her braided hair was styled to perfection, her wide eyes framed by delicate makeup, and yet all she could feel was cold emptiness. As she walked down the aisle, clutching a bouquet of white roses, her gaze fell on James Harrington standing at the altar. He was undeniably handsome, despite his age, his dark hair brushed back, his strong jawline sharp beneath the tailored suit. His blue eyes were calm and unreadable as they met hers. Sophie's hands trembled as she approached him. The priest's words were a blur. "Do you, Sophie Evans, take James Harrington to be your husband?" Sophie's mouth felt dry, her lips trembling as the weight of the moment pressed down on her. She glanced toward her uncle and aunt standing at the side with smug expressions. They had sold her, traded her innocence and freedom for money. Her chest constricted painfully. Slowly, her eyes lifted to James's face. He was watching her with quiet intensity, his gaze unwavering. Her throat tightened, and a single tear rolled down her cheek as she whispered, "I do." James's hand was gentle as he slipped the ring onto her finger. A round of applause erupted from the guests, but Sophie felt nothing but a sinking weight in her chest. As James leaned in to kiss her, his lips brushed softly against her cheek, lingering only a moment before he pulled back. Sophie's heart raced violently, her palms sweating as James's hand rested lightly on her back while they walked down the aisle together. She was now Mrs. James Harrington, the billionaire's wife, a title she never wanted. The reception was a blur of forced smiles and congratulations. Sophie sat beside James at the long table, her hands resting stiffly in her lap. James spoke to the guests with effortless charm, but Sophie barely heard a word. Her eyes remained downcast, her heart pounding with quiet dread as she realized what awaited her that night. When the reception ended, James guided Sophie toward the car, waiting to take them to his mansion. The ride was silent, the tension between them thick and palpable. Sophie's mind raced as the car pulled up to the grand estate, a sprawling mansion surrounded by marble pillars and glowing lights. James helped her out of the car, his hand warm against her waist, but Sophie's body tensed at the touch. Inside the house, James's staff greeted them with polite bows before disappearing. Sophie's heart hammered violently as James led her toward the grand staircase. Every step felt heavier than the last. As they reached the master bedroom, James opened the door, and Sophie's breath hitched. The room was lavish, decorated in shades of gold and cream, with a massive, king-sized bed dominating the center. Sophie froze at the threshold, her wide eyes filling with fresh tears as James stepped inside and turned toward her. "Come in," he said softly. Sophie's throat tightened as she hesitated, her mind screaming to run, but James's gaze softened. "Sophie, you don't have to be afraid," he said gently. "I won't hurt you." Sophie's lips parted in shock. She hadn't expected kindness. Slowly, she stepped inside, her heart hammering as James closed the door behind them. And in that quiet room, for the first time since her parents died, Sophie began to wonder if there was more to James Harrington than she had imagined. The morning of Sophie's wedding felt like a funeral. The soft sunlight filtering through the curtains did nothing to lift the weight crushing her chest as she sat before the grand vanity in her room, watching her reflection with hollow eyes. Her brown skin glowed under the careful touch of the makeup artist, her wide, expressive eyes framed by delicately applied eyeliner and shimmering shadow, and her full lips tinted a soft pink. Her long braided hair had been styled into an intricate updo, decorated with delicate pearls that gleamed under the light. She looked like a vision, a breathtakingly beautiful bride, but inside, she felt like a prisoner walking toward her execution. Sophie's trembling hands rested on her lap, clutching the edge of the silk robe draped over her slender frame. Her chest heaved with shallow, panicked breaths as the weight of what was about to happen settled over her like a suffocating fog. Just hours ago, Margaret had walked into the room with a cold smile and the wedding gown draped over her arm. "Get dressed," Margaret had ordered. "The guests are arriving soon." Sophie's heart had raced wildly as her aunt's words sunk in. "Please don't make me do this," she had whispered, her voice cracking. But Margaret's eyes had turned sharp and unforgiving. "It's already done, Sophie. You don't have a choice." The finality of those words had shattered her remaining hope, leaving her numb as the bridal stylist slipped the gown over her head, smoothing the delicate lace and satin into place. Now, as Sophie sat in the bridal suite, her hands shaking violently, her heart screamed at her to run. But where could she go? She had no family, no money, and nowhere to hide from the powerful grip of her uncle and aunt. A soft knock on the door pulled Sophie from her spiraling thoughts. "It's time," a woman's voice called from the other side. Sophie's heart stuttered painfully as the door opened, revealing Robert standing in the hallway, dressed in a sharp black suit. His cold eyes swept over her, and for a moment, a flicker of approval crossed his face. "You look acceptable," he said stiffly. Sophie's throat tightened as she stood on shaky legs, the weight of the gown heavy against her trembling body. "Please," she whispered again, her eyes glistening with tears. "Please don't make me do this." Robert's mouth curled into a twisted smile. "Don't embarrass us, Sophie. You owe us." With that, he turned and offered his arm. Sophie's heart hammered against her ribcage as she reluctantly slipped her arm through his. Her knees felt weak as Robert guided her through the hallway, her heels clicking softly against the polished marble floor. The grand cathedral doors loomed ahead, guarded by towering floral arrangements of white roses and lilies. Sophie's breath hitched painfully as the heavy doors creaked open, revealing the vast sanctuary filled with rows of elegantly dressed guests. Their heads turned toward her in unison, the quiet murmur of voices falling into stunned silence as Sophie stepped into the aisle. A soft gasp rippled through the crowd. She knew what they were seeing: a young, beautiful bride with wide, glistening eyes, her brown skin glowing beneath the soft candlelight, her long train trailing behind her like a cascade of white silk. Sophie's gaze lifted toward the altar, and her stomach twisted violently. James Harrington stood at the end of the aisle, his tall, broad frame cutting a powerful figure beneath the tailored perfection of his black suit. His dark hair was brushed back from his chiseled face, his piercing blue eyes focused intently on her. He was handsome, there was no denying that, but there was an undeniable edge to him, a quiet intensity that made Sophie's skin prickle with unease. He didn't smile as she approached. His expression remained composed, his eyes dark and calculating beneath the dim lighting. Sophie's feet felt leaden as Robert guided her down the aisle, her heart pounding so loudly it echoed in her ears. Every step brought her closer to the inevitable. Tears blurred her vision as the priest's solemn voice rose above the hush of the room. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." Sophie's breath hitched painfully as she reached the altar, Robert releasing her hand as James extended his. Sophie's hand trembled violently as James's long, warm fingers curled around hers. His grip was surprisingly gentle, but it didn't ease the crushing panic flooding her chest. "Do you, Sophie Evans, take James Harrington to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Sophie's throat tightened painfully. Her lips trembled as tears slipped down her cheeks. "Say no," her mind screamed. But Robert's sharp gaze burned into her from across the room, his warning clear. Sophie's knees buckled beneath the weight of fear and helplessness as the priest repeated the question. James's gaze remained steady, his blue eyes watching her intently, but there was no pressure in his hold. Finally, Sophie's lips parted, and the single word slipped from her mouth in a broken whisper. "I do." A quiet murmur spread through the room as James slid the diamond ring onto her delicate finger. Sophie's heart twisted painfully as James's hand brushed against hers. Her eyes fluttered shut as the priest's voice rose again. "You may now kiss the bride." Sophie's breath caught as James's hand moved to her waist, his touch light and careful. He leaned in slowly, and Sophie's heart hammered wildly as his lips brushed softly against her cheek. The touch was barely there, fleeting and unexpectedly tender, but it left a strange warmth in its wake. The applause from the crowd felt hollow in Sophie's ears as James's hand settled gently on her lower back, guiding her toward the exit. Her knees shook as they stepped into the cool evening air, the soft breeze stirring the tendrils of hair framing her face. A sleek, black limousine waited at the curb. James opened the door for her, his gaze calm and unwavering as he held out his hand. Sophie hesitated, her heart racing with fear and uncertainty, before reluctantly slipping her hand into his. The ride to James's estate was silent, the tension between them thick and palpable. Sophie sat stiffly beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap as her eyes darted toward the passing city lights. Her chest tightened painfully as the limousine pulled through the gates of a sprawling estate. The mansion was enormous, glowing beneath the soft glow of the exterior lights. James's hand rested lightly on her back as he guided her toward the front door. Sophie's stomach clenched violently as the butler opened the door, leading them through the grand marble foyer. James's hand slipped from her waist as they reached the staircase. "It's late," James said quietly. "You should rest." Sophie's breath stuttered. I'm not ready," she whispered. James's eyes softened as he nodded. "I understand." His gaze held hers for a long moment before he turned toward the stairs. Sophie's heart thudded painfully as James disappeared down the hall, leaving her alone in the quiet echo of the grand estate. She sank onto the edge of the leather sofa, her hands shaking as tears blurred her vision. She had become James Harrington's wife, but in her heart, she felt like she had lost everything. That night, the grand bedroom felt cold and suffocating, despite its lavish beauty. The massive, four-poster bed draped in soft white linens and adorned with embroidered silk pillows stood like a silent reminder of the marriage Sophie had never wanted. Sophie sat on the edge of the bed, her slender frame trembling as she hugged her knees to her chest, her breath shallow and uneven. The golden chandelier above cast a warm glow over the room, but it did nothing to ease the fear and confusion tightening in her chest. The cream-colored walls, decorated with intricate gold accents, closed in on her, making her feel trapped. Her delicate hands gripped the hem of her satin nightgown, her knuckles turning white as tears streamed silently down her soft brown cheeks. Her wide, expressive eyes were swollen from crying, her beautifully braided hair resting gently against her back as her trembling lips pressed together in a desperate attempt to hold back the sobs threatening to escape. Her heart pounded painfully in her chest as the large mahogany door creaked open, the sound echoing through the quiet room like a warning bell. Sophie's breath hitched violently as James stepped inside, his tall frame cutting an imposing silhouette against the soft glow of the hallway lights. He had removed his suit jacket, leaving him in a crisp, white shirt with the top buttons undone, revealing a hint of his chiseled chest. His dark hair was slightly tousled, and his piercing blue eyes softened as they landed on her trembling form. Sophie's whole body stiffened, her heart racing wildly as James closed the door behind him with a soft click. He stood there for a moment, studying her with an unreadable expression, before slowly walking toward her. Sophie's hands clenched the silk sheets beneath her as fear shot through her veins. This is it, she thought, her breath quickening. He's going to expect something. He's going to. But James stopped several feet away from her, his gaze calm and steady. He sat down on the edge of the sofa across from the bed, resting his elbows on his knees as his hands clasped together. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Sophie's wide eyes shimmered with fear and uncertainty as she watched him cautiously, her breath still shallow and uneven. Finally, James's deep, smooth voice broke the tense silence. "Sophie," he said gently, his gaze steady and calm. "I know you didn't want this." Sophie's breath caught painfully as her eyes widened. He sounded kind, gentle, not at all what she had expected. "I know your uncle and aunt forced you into this marriage because of their own selfish reasons," James continued, his eyes softening as he watched the tears sliding down her cheeks. "I know you're scared, and I know you don't trust me." Sophie's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her heart twisted painfully as James leaned back slightly, his piercing gaze never leaving hers. "I'm not going to force you to do anything you don't want to do," he said softly. Sophie's breath shuddered as her heart thudded violently against her ribs. "You don't have to pretend to be comfortable with me. I'm not expecting anything from you, Sophie, and I certainly won't touch you unless you want me to." Sophie's lips trembled as another tear slid down her cheek. She stared at him in disbelief, trying to understand why he was being so kind. You don't want," she whispered, her voice shaking. James's smile was faint but genuine as he stood and approached her, his tall frame towering over her delicate form. "No," he said simply. "You're my wife now, but I'm not here to take advantage of you. I want you to feel safe with me." Sophie's chest tightened painfully as James leaned down, brushing a loose braid behind her ear. His touch was so gentle, so careful, as though he was terrified of scaring her. "You don't have to thank me," he whispered. "I only want to see you smile." Sophie's throat tightened painfully. His words echoed through her mind, unraveling all the assumptions she had made about him. Slowly, James pulled back, offering her a soft smile before turning toward the large window overlooking the vast gardens outside. Sophie stood frozen for a moment, her heart still racing as she watched James's broad shoulders and relaxed posture. He was so calm, so controlled, and yet there was something beneath that carefully composed exterior, a quiet sadness, perhaps even loneliness. That night, Sophie lay awake in bed, her mind spinning with confusion and a flicker of something new hope. James was asleep on the sofa, his arm resting casually over his forehead, his breathing deep and steady. Sophie's chest tightened painfully. He didn't have to sleep on the sofa. He had every right to share the bed with her. After all, they were married. But he had chosen to give her space, to let her decide, and that quiet patience, that thoughtful kindness, confused her more than anything. The next morning, Sophie found herself searching for him. She wandered through the mansion's sprawling hallways, her silk robe flowing around her ankles. She found James in the study, seated at the grand mahogany desk, with papers spread out in front of him. He looked up when she entered, his blue eyes softening with quiet warmth. "Good morning," he said, setting down his pen. Sophie hesitated in the doorway, her heart racing. Slowly, she approached the desk. "James," she said. He stood, sensing the hesitation in her voice. "Yes?" Her hands twisted together nervously. "1. I just wanted to say thank you for the flowers, the gifts, everything." James's expression remained calm, but a flicker of warmth entered his eyes. "You don't have to thank me," he said gently. Sophie's cheeks flushed as she lowered her gaze. "But I want to," she whispered. James took a step toward her, his hand resting lightly on the curve of her waist. Sophie's breath hitched, but she didn't pull away. "I know you didn't choose this marriage, Sophie," James said quietly, "but I want you to know that you're safe with me. I won't pressure you for anything you're not ready to give." Sophie's heart twisted painfully at the quiet sincerity in his voice. Slowly, she lifted her gaze to meet his, her wide, brown eyes searching his face for any sign of deception. But there was none, only quiet patience and tenderness. Sophie's chest rose and fell with shallow breaths as James's hand lingered at her waist. And then, carefully, slowly, she rested her hand on top of his. James's gaze darkened slightly, but he didn't move. Sophie's lips parted as her heart pounded violently in her chest. "Why? I think I'm starting to understand you," she whispered. James's hand tightened slightly on her waist as his eyes softened with quiet warmth. "Take all the time you need, Sophie," he whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." Sophie's breath shuddered as James leaned down, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. Her eyes fluttered closed as warmth spread through her chest, unraveling the tight knot of fear and confusion that had lived there for so long. And for the first time since her uncle and aunt had forced her into this marriage, Sophie wondered if maybe, just maybe, James Harrington wasn't the cold-hearted billionaire she had imagined. Maybe, just maybe, he was the one person who would finally make her feel safe. That evening, the dining room was bathed in soft, golden light from the crystal chandelier hanging overhead, the glow casting delicate shadows across the rich mahogany table. Sophie sat across from James, her hands resting lightly on her lap as the faint clinking of silverware and china filled the air. The table was elegantly set with fine porcelain and polished silverware. The centerpiece, a delicate arrangement of white roses and lilies, her favorites. Sophie's heart fluttered slightly at the thought that James had remembered such a small detail. She watched him quietly as he poured a glass of red wine and slid it toward her with his usual calm grace. James's piercing blue eyes settled on her, his expression soft but attentive as he said, "You don't have to drink it if you don't want to." Sophie hesitated before wrapping her slender fingers around the stem of the glass. "Thank you," she said softly. The wine was smooth as it touched her lips, the warmth spreading through her chest. James leaned back slightly, the flicker of firelight from the grand fireplace casting golden light across the sharp lines of his face. His suit jacket was draped casually over the back of his chair, his crisp, white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, giving him an air of effortless confidence. Sophie's gaze dropped to her plate, her heart beating a little too fast as the silence between them stretched comfortably. But then James's voice, low and deep, broke the quiet. "Sophie, you mentioned your parents once before. Would you tell me more about them?" Sophie's eyes widened slightly, her grip tightening on the glass. She hadn't expected him to ask about something so personal. Her uncle and aunt had never shown the slightest interest in her life before they took control of it. But James's eyes were steady, calm, and waiting, not demanding, just inviting. Slowly, Sophie set the glass down, her fingers brushing against the edge of her napkin. "My parents," she started, her voice soft and unsure. James nodded encouragingly. Sophie's gaze softened as memories of her childhood slowly surfaced. They were kind, loving. "My father worked as a history professor. My mother was a painter." Her lips curled faintly into a sad smile. "She used to set up her easel by the window, where the sunlight was the brightest. I would sit on the floor beside her, just watching her mix colors on the palette. Sometimes she'd let me help." Sophie's voice trembled slightly as warmth and sadness intertwined in her chest. "They used to take me to the park every Sunday. We'd have picnics under this big oak tree. My dad would tell stories about knights and queens and magical castles, while my mom would sketch the trees." A quiet laugh escaped her throat. "They always made me feel safe." Her smile faltered as the darker memories returned. The night of the accident, the way the phone call had shattered her world forever. Sophie's eyes darkened, her hands tightening in her lap. After they died, everything changed. James's gaze sharpened, his jaw tightening slightly as his eyes darkened. "Your uncle and aunt," he said. Sophie swallowed hard. "They took me in, but not out of love. They saw me as a burden, a financial obligation. When I turned 18, they made it clear that I would need to repay the debt of raising me." Her breath hitched painfully. "They never asked me what I wanted. They only cared about what I could give them in return." James's expression darkened dangerously, his blue eyes narrowing with quiet fury. Sophie saw the tension in his shoulders, the cold sharpness beneath his otherwise calm exterior. But when he spoke, his voice was controlled and steady. "And they forced you into this marriage," he said quietly. Sophie hesitated before nodding. "Yes." James's hand tightened around the stem of his glass, the edge of his jaw tightening visibly. But instead of anger, Sophie saw something else behind his gaze, a quiet protectiveness, as though he was carefully containing his emotions for her sake. Slowly, James set down his glass and leaned forward, his elbows resting on the edge of the table. "You deserve better," he said softly. Sophie's chest tightened painfully at the quiet sincerity in his voice. She lowered her gaze, her fingers twisting in her lap. "What about you?" she asked hesitantly. James's brow lifted slightly. "What about me?" Sophie hesitated before meeting his gaze. "You've been kind to me, but you don't seem happy." James's smile was faint and hollow. "Happiness was never a priority for me," he said. Sophie's gaze softened. "Why?" James's eyes darkened as a shadow crossed his face. "I built my empire from nothing," he said quietly. "My father was harsh, ruthless. He believed that strength was the only way to survive in business and in life. He taught me to suppress weakness, to focus only on success." Sophie's breath hitched as James's hand tightened slightly on the table. "I spent years building my company, expanding, consolidating power. I thought success would fill the emptiness." His lips curled bitterly. It didn't. Sophie's throat tightened as the quiet vulnerability beneath his words settled into her chest. Slowly, James's gaze softened as he looked at her. "Then I met you." Sophie's heart stopped. "James." His gaze darkened. "I know you didn't choose this marriage, Sophie, and I know I have no right to expect you to care for me." He hesitated, his eyes dark and intense. "But having you here, it's the first time in a long time that I don't feel completely alone." Sophie's breath shuddered as warmth spread through her chest, unraveling the tight knots of fear and uncertainty. Slowly, James reached across the table, his fingers brushing lightly over her hand. Sophie stiffened instinctively, but instead of pulling away, she let him touch her. His hand was warm and steady, his thumb brushing softly against her skin. "I don't expect you to love me, Sophie," James said quietly, "but I want you to feel safe here with me." Sophie's eyes shimmered with unshed tears as her chest tightened painfully. Slowly, her fingers curled around his hand. James's gaze darkened as his thumb brushed over the back of her hand. Sophie's lips parted, her heart pounding violently in her chest as warmth spread through her limbs. James's expression softened as he leaned closer. His hand slid up to her cheek, his fingers brushing a loose braid behind her ear. Sophie's breath hitched, but this time she didn't pull away. Slowly, her eyes fluttered closed as James's touch lingered against her skin. "You're not alone anymore," Sophie whispered. James's chest rose and fell with a shaky breath. "Neither are you." Sophie's heart hammered painfully as James leaned closer, his forehead resting lightly against hers. And for the first time since her parents had died, Sophie felt warmth and safety begin to bloom quietly within her chest. It was a quiet evening, the soft glow of the dimmed lights casting long shadows along the polished marble floor of the grand mansion. Sophie sat by the large window in the living room, her slender fingers tracing the condensation on the glass as she watched the heavy rainfall outside. The rhythmic patter of raindrops against the glass blended with the faint crackling of the fireplace, creating an oddly soothing atmosphere. Sophie's thoughts wandered, her heart unusually light despite the storm outside. Over the past few weeks, things had shifted between her and James in ways she never anticipated. He had become different, not the cold, distant billionaire she had once feared, but someone who made her feel seen, heard, and strangely protected. She had started noticing the way he always made sure she had everything she needed, whether it was her favorite breakfast, prepared exactly how she liked it, or the extra blanket he would drape over her shoulders when she sat reading late into the night. He never imposed, never demanded, but his presence had become a steady comfort in her life. Her fingers stilled against the window, as the sound of the heavy oak door opening echoed through the hallway. James stepped inside, his tall frame slightly slumped as he removed his rain-speckled trench coat and handed it to the butler. His face looked pale under the low light, dark circles faintly visible beneath his piercing blue eyes. Sophie's gaze softened as she watched him loosen his tie and run a hand through his damp hair. He looked exhausted. Without thinking, Sophie stood and walked toward him. James's gaze lifted, his expression momentarily brightening at the sight of her. "Sophie," he said softly, his voice rough with fatigue. "You're still awake?" Sophie nodded, her eyes searching his face. "You look tired," she said gently. James's lips curled into a faint smile. "Long day at the office." He loosened his tie further, his broad shoulders sagging slightly under the weight of unseen burdens. Sophie hesitated for a brief moment before saying, "Sit down. I'll make you some tea." James's brows lifted in faint surprise. "You don't have to." "I want to," Sophie said softly, her voice steady but warm. James studied her for a long moment before giving her a slight nod. Sophie turned toward the kitchen, her heart fluttering strangely in her chest. She moved with quiet purpose, heating water and carefully selecting a blend of chamomile and mint. The one she had learned helped him sleep better. As the tea steeped, Sophie arranged a small tray with a delicate china cup and a plate of biscuits. Her hands trembled slightly as she carried the tray into the living room, where James sat on the plush leather sofa, his head resting against the back, his eyes half closed. Sophie approached quietly, setting the tray down on the glass coffee table. "Here," she said softly. James's eyes opened, his gaze immediately softening when he saw her. He sat up and leaned forward, taking the cup from her hands with a quiet, "Thank you." His fingers brushed against hers, and Sophie's breath hitched at the warmth of his touch. James took a sip, his eyes closing briefly as he sighed. "Perfect," he murmured. Sophie smiled faintly, her heart swelling with quiet satisfaction. Instead of retreating, she sat down beside him on the sofa, leaving a polite distance between them. They sat in comfortable silence, the firelight flickering against the rich tones of the room. James leaned back, his gaze fixed on the flames, his profile sharp, yet softened by exhaustion. Sophie studied him quietly, the strong line of his jaw, the faint crease between his brows, the way his shoulders seemed weighed down by something unspoken. Without thinking, she reached out and brushed her fingers against his hand. James's eyes opened slowly, his gaze settling on her with quiet surprise. "Sophie." Her cheeks warmed under his gaze, but she didn't pull away. "You should get some rest," she said softly. James's eyes softened, but instead of replying, he shifted toward her. Slowly, carefully, he rested his head against her shoulder. Sophie stiffened, her breath hitching at the unexpected weight of him leaning into her. But James's warmth seeped through her thin sweater, the scent of his cologne a mix of cedar and spice wrapping around her senses. His breath was warm against her skin, his hand resting loosely against his thigh, dangerously close to hers. Sophie's heart hammered violently as her body remained still, unsure of what to do. But when James's breathing steadied, his hand twitching slightly as though fighting sleep, something soft and fragile unfolded in her chest. Slowly, carefully, Sophie relaxed beneath his weight, her hand lifted hesitantly before resting lightly against his forearm. James's breath hitched faintly, but he didn't move away. Instead, his hand slowly shifted until his fingers brushed against hers. Sophie's breath caught as his fingers curled around her hand, his touch steady and warm. Her chest tightened painfully, a strange mixture of fear and tenderness flooding her veins. She glanced down at him, finding his eyes half closed, his expression softer than she had ever seen it. "You're comfortable," Sophie whispered. James's lips curled faintly. "Very." Sophie's cheeks warmed, her heart fluttering helplessly beneath the weight of his quiet trust. James shifted slightly, his head sliding from her shoulder to the curve of her neck. Sophie stiffened, but the warmth of his breath against her skin made her shiver in a way that didn't feel frightening. James's hand tightened slightly around hers, his thumb brushing lazily across her knuckles. "Thank you, Sophie," he murmured, his voice low and rough with sleep. Sophie's chest tightened. Slowly, her other hand lifted, her fingers brushing lightly through his dark hair. James's breath hitched faintly, but he didn't move away. Instead, his hand lifted, resting lightly against her knee. Sophie's heart thudded violently, her hand stilling in his hair. James's breathing deepened, his body relaxing fully against hers. Sophie sat there for what felt like forever, listening to the soft crackle of the fire and the steady sound of James's breathing. The intimacy of it was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. Her hand trembled slightly as she continued to stroke his hair, the softness of his dark locks slipping through her fingers. James shifted closer, his body pressing subtly against hers, his breath warm against the curve of her neck. Sophie's eyes fluttered closed as her heart raced wildly beneath her rib cage. She knew she should pull away, that this closeness was dangerous, but she couldn't seem to make herself move. James's hand slid across her knee, his thumb brushing against the thin fabric of her leggings. Sophie's breath stuttered, heat rushing to her face. James's voice was barely above a whisper as he said, "Stay, just for a little while." Sophie swallowed hard, her chest tightening painfully. Slowly, her fingers brushed against his temple. "Okay," she whispered. James's breath deepened, his body softening further against hers. Sophie's eyes burned with unshed tears as a quiet warmth settled in her chest. And for the first time since the wedding, Sophie realized she didn't feel so afraid anymore. It was late into the night when Sophie shot up from the bed, her breath ragged and shallow as cold sweat clung to her skin. The room was dimly lit by the moonlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting ghostly shadows across the walls. Her chest heaved as her wide eyes darted around the room, her trembling hands clutching the silk sheets. Her heart hammered painfully against her rib cage as the remnants of her nightmare lingered in her mind, a terrifying, twisted memory of the car crash that had stolen her parents from her. She could still hear the sound of metal crunching, the high-pitched scream of her mother's voice, the desperate gasps of her father trying to shield her from the impact. Tears burned her eyes as a choked sob escaped her throat. Her hands covered her face as she tried to steady her breathing, but the suffocating weight of fear pressed down on her chest. She hadn't had a nightmare this intense in years, but tonight it felt so real. Suddenly, the door to the bedroom swung open. Sophie's head snapped toward the sound, her breath hitching when James appeared in the doorway, dressed only in a pair of black silk pajama pants, his chest bare beneath the low light. His hair was slightly tousled from sleep, but his sharp blue eyes were alert and brimming with concern as he crossed the room toward her. "Sophie," he said, his deep voice low, rough with sleep, but the tenderness in his tone made Sophie's heart clench painfully. She wiped at her eyes with trembling fingers, trying to steady her breath as James sat beside her on the edge of the bed. His hand, large and warm, settled gently over hers. "What happened?" he asked softly. Sophie shook her head, her throat tight with emotion. "It's nothing. Just a nightmare," she whispered shakily. But James's gaze darkened as his thumb brushed lightly over her knuckles. "It's not nothing," he said firmly, his hand tightening around hers. Sophie's breath hitched as tears welled up in her eyes. I saw them again," she admitted brokenly. "The accident. My parents." The screams. It felt so real. Her voice cracked, and her chest tightened painfully as a tear slipped down her cheek. James's jaw tensed, and without hesitation, he slid closer and reached out to cup her face with both hands. His thumbs gently brushed away the tears trailing down her cheeks. "It's okay," he whispered. "I'm here. You're safe." Sophie's eyes fluttered shut at the warmth of his touch, her heart pounding wildly beneath her chest. Her breathing hitched as James's forehead rested against hers, his breath soft and steady against her skin. "Just breathe," he whispered. "You're not alone, Sophie. Not anymore." A soft sob broke from Sophie's throat as her hands lifted hesitantly, resting against James's chest. His heartbeat was steady beneath her palms, grounding her, calming her. "Why? Why are you being so kind to me?" she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. James's hand slid down to cradle her shoulders as he pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. His blue gaze was deep and intense, the flicker of moonlight reflecting off his irises. "Because I care about you, Sophie," he said, his voice low and earnest. Sophie's breath stilled, her heart thudding violently in her chest. Her eyes widened as she stared at him, trying to process the weight of his words. "You care about me?" James's gaze softened as his thumb traced the curve of her jaw. "From the moment I saw you, I knew you were different. But it wasn't until you started letting me in, letting me see the real you, that I realized how much you mean to me." Sophie's lips parted, but no sound came out. She could barely breathe beneath the intensity of his gaze. Her heart was hammering so hard she thought it might crack open. James's hand slid down to the nape of her neck, his fingers brushing through her soft braids as his lips curled into a faint, almost vulnerable smile. "You don't have to say anything," he whispered. "I know this marriage wasn't what you wanted, but Sophie, I want you to know, you're not a burden to me. You never were." A tear slipped down Sophie's cheek as his words cut through her heart, unraveling the deep-seated fear and insecurity she had buried for years. Her hands trembled against his chest as her lips parted. I don't understand why you would care about someone like me," she said in a broken whisper. "I'm just ordinary." James's gaze darkened with quiet intensity. "You're not ordinary," he said firmly. "You're brave. You survived losing your parents. You endured the cruelty of your aunt and uncle without letting it harden you. You still smile. You still care about others, even when you've been hurt. That's not ordinary, Sophie. That's strength." Sophie's chest heaved as his words settled deep into her bones. Her throat tightened painfully, and her vision blurred with tears. James's hand slid from her neck to her waist, his touch gentle yet possessive as he pulled her closer. "I see you," he whispered. "All of you. And I care about you not because I have to, but because I want to." Sophie's breath stilled as his forehead touched hers again. Her lips parted as the warmth of his breath ghosted over her mouth. Her hands slid up to his neck, her fingers threading into his dark hair as her chest rose and fell in uneven waves. James's lips hovered a breath away from hers, his blue eyes burning with raw vulnerability. "James," she whispered. His thumb traced her lip again before his hand slid to the back of her neck. "You don't have to be scared anymore," he whispered. "I'll protect you always." Sophie's chest tightened painfully. Her arms instinctively wrapped around his neck, and when James pulled her fully into his lap, she didn't resist. Her face pressed against the warmth of his bare shoulder, her body melting into the strength of his frame. James's hand stroked her back in soothing circles as his lips pressed against her temple. "You're safe," he whispered again. Sophie squeezed her eyes shut, her heart swelling with a foreign but intoxicating warmth. Slowly, she pulled back just enough to look at him. Their faces were so close, their breaths mingling between them. James's eyes darkened as his gaze dropped to her lips again. Sophie's heart stumbled painfully as a wave of heat flushed through her veins. She could feel the tension in the air, the quiet pull between them. But James didn't move. He simply held her, his eyes searching hers with quiet intensity. Sophie swallowed hard before whispering, You're really not going to leave?" James's lips curled into a faint smile. "Never." Sophie's heart swelled painfully. Slowly, hesitantly, she lifted her hand and brushed her fingers along the sharp line of his jaw. James's breath hitched, his hand tightening on her waist. "James." Her voice was barely a breath. He leaned closer, his nose brushing hers as his lips hovered a fraction away from hers. "I'm not going anywhere," he whispered. Sophie's breath shuddered as his lips brushed faintly against hers, a fleeting, delicate touch that sent a tremor through her entire body. And in that moment, Sophie knew something had shifted between them, something irreversible. It was late at night when Sophie walked hand in hand with James along the moonlit beach. The sound of the waves crashing softly against the shore blended with the rhythmic pounding of her heart. The sky was a deep midnight blue, scattered with thousands of glittering stars, and the salty breeze gently brushed through Sophie's loose curls, making them dance around her shoulders. Her bare feet sank slightly into the cool sand with each step, and James's large, warm hand enveloped hers protectively as they walked side by side. His grip was firm yet gentle, his thumb brushing tenderly against her skin, sending shivers down her spine. Sophie had never imagined herself feeling this way, not with James Harrington, the man she had once feared, the man she had once been forced to marry. But now everything felt different. The tension that had once lingered between them had slowly dissolved, replaced by a quiet tenderness that Sophie found herself growing dangerously addicted to. James had been nothing but patient with her, never demanding anything, never forcing her to give more than she was ready to. He had been kind, so achingly kind, that Sophie's heart had begun to soften without her realizing it. The gifts he left for her, the thoughtful way he always ensured her comfort, the way he stood protectively by her side. When her aunt and uncle visited and tried to manipulate her, it had all begun to wear down her defenses. And now, as they walked along the darkened shoreline, the sound of the waves echoing around them, Sophie realized that her heart was no longer guarded. She glanced toward James, her eyes tracing the sharp, handsome lines of his profile, His dark hair was slightly tousled from the sea breeze, and the moonlight cast soft shadows over the chiseled perfection of his face, his strong jawline, the slight furrow of his brow, and the piercing blue of his eyes that seemed to darken when they met hers. He had taken her to this private beach, arranging everything so that they could have a quiet evening alone. After dinner, they had wandered down toward the water, Sophie's bare feet sinking into the wet sand as the waves kissed her ankles. She had never imagined feeling so at ease in his presence, but James had a way of making her feel safe, cherished like she belonged at his side. Sophie's heart fluttered as James slowed to a stop, his hand tugging gently on hers to bring her to a halt. She turned toward him, her breath hitching as his intense blue eyes settled on her face with quiet intensity. The moonlight reflected off the water behind him, creating an ethereal glow that framed his tall, commanding figure. His gaze softened as his hand lifted to her face, his fingers brushing a loose curl behind her ear before trailing down to cup her cheek. Sophie's breath caught as the warmth of his touch spread through her chest. "You've always been so patient with me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the waves. "I never expected this. Never expected you to be so." Her words trailed off as emotion clogged her throat. James's hand slid down to her jawline, his thumb gently tracing the curve of her cheek. His gaze darkened, his lips parting slightly as he watched her with quiet intensity. "I never wanted to force you, Sophie," he said softly. "I wanted you to choose me." Sophie's heart stumbled painfully at his words. Her eyes widened, her breath shuddering in her chest as she stared up at him. His words settled deep inside her, piercing through the last fragile walls she had built around her heart. Slowly, hesitantly, her hands lifted and rested against his chest. Beneath her palms, she could feel the steady beat of his heart, strong and sure. James's gaze darkened as her hand slid upward, her fingertips brushing over the exposed skin of his collarbone. His breath hitched, but he didn't move. He simply stood there, letting her touch him, letting her close the distance between them. Sophie's lips parted as tears burned the back of her eyes. You really mean that?" she whispered. James's jaw tightened as his hand slid to the back of her neck, his thumb brushing against the sensitive skin behind her ear. "I mean it," he said, his voice low and rough. "I don't care how long it takes. I'll wait for you, Sophie, as long as you need." A tear slipped down Sophie's cheek as her chest swelled with warmth. Her heart pounded so hard it hurt, and her hands trembled against his chest. "Why?" she whispered brokenly. "Why would you wait for someone like me?" James's gaze softened as his hand slid down her back, his touch protective yet reverent. "Because you're everything to me," he said simply. "From the moment I married you, from the moment I saw you standing at the altar scared and trembling, I knew I wanted to protect you, to cherish you, to be the man you deserve." Sophie's breath hitched as her fingers curled into his shirt. Her vision blurred with tears, and a soft sob escaped her throat. "I don't deserve that." James's hand tightened on her waist as he pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers. "Yes, you do," he whispered fiercely. "You deserve everything, Sophie. You deserve to be loved completely." Sophie's breath shook as James's nose brushed against hers. Her lips parted as the warmth of his breath ghosted over her mouth. Her hand slid up to his neck, her fingers threading into his dark hair as her chest rose and fell in uneven waves. James's lips hovered a breath away from hers, his blue eyes burning with raw vulnerability. "James," she whispered. His thumb traced her lip again before his hand slid to the back of her neck. "I want you to want me, Sophie," he whispered. "But only when you're ready." Sophie's heart ached painfully as her hands tightened in his hair. Her lips trembled as she whispered, I think I'm already there." James's breath hitched, his eyes widening slightly before darkening with quiet intensity. His hand slid up her back, pressing her body fully against his, as his lips brushed delicately against hers, a fleeting, tentative touch that sent a shiver down Sophie's spine. Her breath hitched, and without thinking, she leaned into him, her lips parting beneath his. James's arms wrapped around her, as his mouth claimed hers in a slow, lingering kiss. His lips were soft and warm, coaxing hers open as his hand cradled the back of her head. Sophie melted into his embrace, her arms tightening around his neck as heat spiraled through her veins. When James finally pulled back, his forehead pressed against hers, his breathing ragged. Sophie's chest heaved as her eyes fluttered open, meeting his intense gaze. James's thumb brushed over her swollen lips as a faint smile curved his mouth. "I love you, Sophie," he whispered. Sophie's heart stumbled painfully in her chest. Her hand slid down to his chest as her lips parted, her breath shaking. I think I love you too," she whispered. James's smile widened as he pulled her back into his arms, his lips brushing her forehead. "We'll take this at your pace," he whispered. "But, Sophie, you're mine, and I'm never letting you go." Sophie's heart swelled painfully as her arms tightened around his neck. She buried her face against his chest, inhaling the steady rhythm of his heart as the sound of the ocean surrounded them. And for the first time in a long time, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. It was late at night when Sophie stood outside James's bedroom door, her heart pounding so hard that it felt like it might shatter through her chest. Her slender fingers trembled as they brushed over the soft fabric of her silk nightgown, the delicate material clinging to the gentle curves of her body. The hall was dimly lit, the soft glow of the moonlight filtering through the large windows, casting pale streaks across the cool marble floor. Sophie took a shaky breath, her bare feet pressing against the chilled surface beneath her as she gathered the courage to raise her hand to the doorknob. Her pulse thrummed wildly in her ears as her fingertips brushed the handle. For weeks now, she had felt herself falling for James, her guarded heart slowly unraveling beneath the steady warmth of his affection. He had never pushed her, never asked for more than she was willing to give, but his patience and quiet tenderness had stirred something deep inside her, something that frightened her as much as it thrilled her. She had spent countless nights lying awake, her heart aching with a need she couldn't quite name, her body craving the warmth of his touch, even as her mind hesitated to cross that invisible boundary. But tonight was different. Tonight, Sophie knew what she wanted. She couldn't fight it anymore. With a shaky breath, she pushed open the door and stepped inside. The room was dimly lit by the soft flicker of the fireplace, the golden light dancing across the dark mahogany walls and the large, neatly made bed. James sat on the edge of the bed, dressed in a loose white shirt and dark pajama pants, his hair slightly tousled from sleep. His head lifted the moment Sophie stepped inside, his sharp blue eyes widening with quiet surprise as he took in the sight of her standing in the doorway. Sophie's cheeks flushed under his intense gaze, but she didn't back down. Her slender frame trembled as she closed the door behind her and took a tentative step forward, her silk nightgown fluttering against her thighs with each breath she took. "Sophie." James's deep voice was rough with sleep and confusion as he sat up straighter, his brow furrowing. Sophie swallowed hard, her lips parting as she forced herself to meet his gaze. "I'm not scared anymore," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. Her heart hammered painfully as James's eyes darkened, the muscles in his jaw tightening as his gaze swept over her delicate figure. Sophie's hands trembled at her sides as she took another step toward him, her bare feet soundless against the plush carpet. "I want you," she said softly, her voice thick with vulnerability and quiet longing. James's breath visibly caught. His hands gripped the edge of the mattress as he watched her approach, his piercing gaze clouded with a mixture of hesitation and desire. "Sophie," his voice was low and strained, his body tense as though he were holding himself back. Sophie's heart pounded so hard it hurt, but she didn't stop. Slowly, hesitantly, she knelt before him on the bed, her delicate hands resting lightly on his knees as she leaned in closer. "I want you," she repeated, her voice trembling as her fingers slid over the fabric of his pants. "Not because I feel like I have to, but because I want this. I want you." James's eyes burned into hers, his hands trembling as they lifted toward her face. His fingers brushed her cheeks as though he were afraid she might disappear, his thumb tracing the curve of her jawline with exquisite tenderness. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Sophie's eyes softened as her hand lifted to cover his. "Yes," she whispered, "I'm sure." James's breath hitched. His hand slid to the back of her neck as his gaze darkened with quiet intensity. Slowly, hesitantly, he leaned in, his lips brushing over hers in a feather-like touch that sent a shiver cascading down Sophie's spine. Her breath hitched, and without thinking, she leaned into him, her lips parting beneath his. James's hand tightened at the back of her neck as his mouth moved over hers, soft and coaxing at first, then deepening with quiet hunger. Sophie's hand slid up his chest, her fingers curling into the thin fabric of his shirt as warmth bloomed through her chest. James's hands slid down to her waist, his touch reverent as he pulled her onto his lap. Sophie gasped softly as her legs straddled his thighs, her nightgown riding up over her hips. James's breath was ragged against her mouth as his hand slid up her back, his fingers skimming over the smoothness of her bare skin. His mouth left hers only long enough for him to whisper her name, Sophie. Her name was a prayer on his lips as his mouth found the curve of her neck, his teeth grazing her skin with delicate reverence. Sophie's eyes fluttered closed as her head tilted back, a soft moan slipping from her lips as James's hand slid beneath the thin straps of her nightgown and slowly pushed them down over her shoulders. His mouth traced a heated path down her throat, his hands trembling slightly as they explored the softness of her bare skin. Sophie's hand slid into his hair, her fingers curling into the thick strands as heat spiraled low in her stomach. James. His name broke on a breathless gasp as his lips returned to hers, claiming her mouth in a deep, searing kiss that left her breathless. James's arms wrapped around her, lifting her easily as he turned and laid her gently against the pillows. His gaze darkened as he hovered over her, his hand cupping her cheek as his thumb brushed over her flushed skin. "I'll stop if you want me to," he said softly, his blue eyes blazing with quiet intensity. Sophie's hands lifted to his face, her thumb brushing over the curve of his cheekbone. "Don't stop," she whispered. "Please." James's breath shuddered as his lips captured hers once more, his body pressing down against hers in a slow, delicious heat. Sophie's arms slid around his back, her legs wrapping around his waist as their kiss deepened. The silk of her nightgown slid over her skin as James's hands explored her body with exquisite tenderness, his touch reverent and full of quiet worship. Sophie's heart pounded as James's mouth traced a heated path down her collarbone, his hands sliding beneath the thin material of her nightgown and slowly peeling it away from her body. Her breath hitched as the cool air kissed her bare skin, but James's hands were there warming her, soothing her. "You're so beautiful," he whispered against her skin. Sophie's eyes filled with tears as James's hands cradled her face, his gaze burning with quiet intensity. His lips brushed over hers as he whispered, "I love you, Sophie. I've always loved you." Sophie's heart swelled painfully as her hands slid over his back, her lips parting beneath his in a soft, shuddering gasp. "I love you too," she whispered. James's breath hitched, and then his mouth was on hers again, his hands trembling slightly as he claimed her body with reverent tenderness. Their night was slow and filled with quiet passion, James's hands worshiping her body with the care of a man who had waited his entire life for this moment. And when Sophie finally collapsed against his chest, her breathing ragged and her heart pounding, James's arms wrapped around her tightly, holding her as though he never intended to let her go. Sophie's head rested against his chest as his heartbeat thundered beneath her ear. "You're mine, Sophie," James whispered, his lips pressing a soft kiss to her hair. "Forever." Sophie smiled softly as sleep began to tug at her eyelids. "Forever," she whispered. And as James's arms tightened around her, Sophie knew that she had finally found where she belonged. The morning sun filtered softly through the sheer white curtains, casting delicate patterns of golden light across the expansive bedroom. James lay on his side, his head propped up on one hand as his gaze lingered over Sophie's sleeping face. His other arm was wrapped protectively around her waist, her warm, delicate frame nestled against his bare chest beneath the soft white sheets. Her long, dark lashes fluttered against her cheeks, her breathing soft and even, her chest rising and falling in a quiet rhythm that calmed something deep within James's soul. His fingers brushed a stray lock of her golden brown hair away from her face, the soft texture sliding through his fingertips like silk. Even in sleep, Sophie looked breathtaking, her lips slightly parted, her cheeks faintly flushed from the warmth of their shared night. James's heart tightened painfully as he studied her, overwhelmed by the quiet beauty of this moment. For so long, he had guarded his heart, convinced that love was dangerous, a weakness he couldn't afford. But Sophie had unraveled him piece by piece, her quiet strength and gentle soul slowly softening the walls he had built around himself for years. Last night had changed everything. Last night had not only sealed his desire for her, it had cemented his love for her, a love so deep and consuming that he knew he could never go back to the man he had been before. He couldn't imagine his life without her anymore. She stirred slightly beneath his arm, her soft body shifting closer to him as her brow furrowed faintly in sleep. James's gaze softened as he leaned down, his lips brushing over her forehead in a feather-like kiss. Sophie's eyes fluttered open slowly, hazy with sleep, and when her gaze met his, a soft smile curved her lips. "Good morning," she whispered, her voice still rough with sleep. James smiled, his hand sliding up her back to gently brush through her hair. "Good morning, beautiful," he murmured, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek. Sophie's cheeks flushed faintly as she gazed up at him, her hand sliding over his chest, her fingers brushing over the hard muscles beneath his smooth skin. "You're staring at me," she teased softly, her eyes glinting with quiet warmth. James's lips curved as he leaned down, his mouth brushing over hers in a brief but tender kiss. "I can't help it," he whispered against her lips. "You're too beautiful." Sophie's heart thudded painfully beneath her ribs at the quiet reverence in his voice. Slowly, her hand slid up to his face, her fingers tracing over the sharp line of his jaw, her thumb brushing over the curve of his lower lip. "James," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. His gaze darkened as his hand slid over her waist, his thumb brushing over the bare skin just beneath the curve of her ribs. "What is it?" he asked softly. Sophie's eyes filled with quiet emotion as her hand cupped his cheek, her thumb stroking gently over the rough stubble along his jawline. "I love you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. A sharp breath escaped James's lips as his eyes widened slightly. His hand tightened against her waist as his other hand lifted to cradle her face. "Sophie," he whispered, his voice breaking slightly. Sophie's hand slid into his hair as she leaned closer, her lips brushing over his mouth. "I love you, James," she repeated, her voice stronger this time. "I don't care how we started. I don't care what anyone thinks. I love you." James's breath hitched as his forehead pressed against hers, his hand trembling as it slid up to the nape of her neck. "I've loved you since the day I saw you," he whispered, his voice raw with quiet vulnerability. Sophie's lips parted as his mouth claimed hers in a deep, tender kiss. His hands slid into her hair as his thumb brushed over her jawline, his body pressing gently against hers as her arms curled around his neck. The sheets rustled softly beneath them as James's mouth moved over her, slow and reverent, as though he were savoring the feel of her lips beneath his. Sophie melted into him, her heart pounding wildly in her chest as warmth flooded through her veins. When James finally pulled away, his breath shuddering, his eyes were bright with quiet emotion. "I didn't know it was possible to feel this way," he said softly, his fingers brushing over her cheek. "But you make me want to be better. You make me believe in love again." Sophie's heart swelled painfully as her hand slid over his chest. "You don't have to be perfect for me to love you," she whispered. "You already are everything I've ever wanted." James's breath hitched as his hand slid down her back, pulling her closer until there was no space left between them. "Marry me," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Sophie's breath caught as her eyes widened. "What?" James's gaze darkened as his thumb traced over the curve of her lower lip. "Marry me, Sophie," he repeated. "Be mine forever." Sophie's heart pounded so hard it hurt as tears filled her eyes. "James," he smiled faintly, his forehead pressing against hers. "You don't have to answer now," he whispered, "but I need you to know I'm not letting you go ever." Sophie's lips trembled as her hand slid over his shoulders. "Yes," she whispered, her voice shaking. James's breath hitched. "Yes?" Sophie's smile widened as tears slipped down her cheeks. "Yes," she repeated. James's arms tightened around her as his mouth claimed hers in a deep, searing kiss. Sophie's arms wrapped around his neck as he rolled her beneath him, his hands sliding over her sides as warmth and quiet reverence filled the space between them. James's mouth brushed over hers as he whispered, "You're mine, Sophie, forever." Sophie smiled as her hands slid into his hair. "Forever," she whispered. And from that day on, they were inseparable. James showered Sophie with quiet affection, always making sure she was comfortable and happy. He took her on romantic vacations to private islands, where they watched the sunset over the water, their hands intertwined. James would wake her with soft kisses every morning, his arms wrapped around her as he whispered, "I love you." Sophie's heart softened more each day as James's quiet devotion deepened. He would surprise her with fresh flowers, leaving them on her nightstand with a note that always read, "Forever yours." Sophie's days were filled with laughter and quiet intimacy, and her nights were filled with James's reverent touch and whispered declarations of love. When her aunt and uncle tried to contact her, James calmly told them that Sophie belonged to him now, and he would protect her from anyone who tried to hurt her. Sophie's heart swelled with quiet gratitude, as she realized that James had not only given her love, he had given her safety, security, and a future she never dreamed possible. Months passed in quiet happiness, their bond growing deeper with each passing day. And when James finally slid a diamond ring onto Sophie's finger beneath the pale glow of a beachside sunset, Sophie smiled through her tears as she whispered, "Forever." And as James kissed her, his arms wrapped tightly around her waist, Sophie knew with absolute certainty that this was only the beginning of their forever. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when Sophie found herself sitting in the grand hall of James's company headquarters, the expansive marble floors gleaming beneath the soft glow of the golden chandeliers. The room was filled with journalists, business partners, and high-profile investors, all dressed in immaculate suits and elegant dresses, their attention fixed on the elevated platform at the front of the room where James stood. Sophie sat in the front row, her hands resting nervously on her lap, as her heart hammered wildly against her chest. James was calm, composed as always, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that hugged his powerful frame perfectly. His dark hair was styled neatly, and his sharp blue eyes scanned the crowd with quiet confidence. Sophie didn't know why he had asked her to come today. He had only said, "There's something I need you to see," but the intensity in his gaze when he had spoken those words had made her breath hitch. Now, as she watched him stand before the podium, the anticipation in the room growing thicker with every passing second, Sophie felt her palms grow damp. James's hand tightened on the edge of the podium as he leaned forward slightly, his gaze piercing through the crowd until it settled on her. His eyes softened as he smiled faintly. "Thank you all for coming today," James began, his voice smooth and controlled. "As you all know, this company has been my life for the past 15 years. I built it from the ground up, poured my blood, sweat, and tears into every deal, every decision. And yet, I always felt like something was missing. Success without purpose means nothing. Power without love is empty." Sophie's breath caught as James's gaze remained locked on her. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. James's eyes darkened with quiet emotion as his hands slid into the pockets of his trousers. "Recently, I realized that my life was incomplete because I was missing the one thing that mattered most: love, trust, a reason to wake up every morning and want to be better. And I found that reason when Sophie came into my life." Sophie's eyes widened as whispers rippled through the crowd. Her chest tightened painfully as James's gaze softened even further, the emotion in his expression making her breath tremble. "I didn't deserve her love at first," James continued, his voice growing quieter. "I married her under complicated circumstances. I never expected her to love me. I certainly never expected to love her. But Sophie, she changed me. Her strength, her kindness, her quiet courage, they made me realize that everything I thought I knew about life and love was wrong." Sophie's hands flew to her mouth as tears burned at the corners of her eyes. James's gaze never wavered from hers as he continued, "And because she's given me the greatest gift I've ever known, her love, I want to give her everything in return." He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a sleek, black envelope. The room fell completely still as James held it up. Inside this envelope is the official documentation transferring full ownership of every company under my name, every property I own, and every asset in my possession to Sophie. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Sophie's eyes widened in shock as the breath left her lungs in a sharp exhale. Her hands trembled as she shook her head. "James." James's gaze darkened as he stepped down from the platform, the sound of his polished shoes echoing off the marble floor as he approached her. Sophie stood on shaky legs as he stopped directly in front of her, his piercing blue eyes burning into hers. He gently took her hands, his thumb brushing over her trembling fingers. "I know what you're thinking," James whispered, his gaze softening. "And no, this isn't about money. It's not about power. It's about trust." Sophie's lips trembled as tears blurred her vision. "James, you can't. This is too much." "No," he cut her off gently. His hand slid up to cup her cheek as his thumb brushed away the tear that slipped down her face. "You gave me your heart when I didn't deserve it. You taught me how to love, how to trust. You made me a better man. And now, I want you to know that you have all of me, my heart, my soul, everything I have. It belongs to you now." Sophie's breath shuddered as James's forehead pressed gently against hers. "This isn't about wealth, Sophie," he whispered. "It's about giving you the power to walk away if you ever want to. It's about showing you that I love you enough to let you go if you need to." Sophie's heart shattered at the quiet vulnerability in his voice. Her hands slid up his chest, her fingers trembling as they curled into the soft fabric of his suit. "I don't want to walk away," she whispered brokenly. James's eyes darkened as his hand cupped the back of her neck. "Then stay," he breathed. "Stay with me, Sophie." Sophie's lips parted as his mouth claimed hers in a deep, tender kiss. The crowd melted away as James's arms wrapped tightly around her, his body pressing close as Sophie melted into his warmth. When they finally pulled apart, Sophie's breath trembled as her hand slid up to frame his face. "You didn't have to give me everything to prove you love me," she whispered. "I already knew." James's lips curved faintly as his hand slid down her back. "I know," he murmured, "but I wanted to give you everything anyway." Sophie's heart swelled painfully as her arms curled around his neck. "I love you, James," she whispered. James's breath hitched as his eyes softened. "Say it again," he breathed. Sophie smiled as her hand slid into his hair. "I love you," she repeated. "I love you so much." James's mouth claimed hers again, his hands sliding beneath her waist as he lifted her effortlessly into his arms. The crowd erupted into applause, but Sophie barely heard it. All she could hear was the sound of James's heartbeat beneath her ear, steady and strong. All she could feel was the quiet strength of his arms around her. And as James carried her out of the room, his lips brushing over her temple as he whispered, "Forever," Sophie knew with absolute certainty that she had finally found her home. It was a warm summer evening when Sophie sat propped up in the plush hospital bed, her chest rising and falling in quiet exhaustion as the soft glow of the evening sun filtered through the sheer white curtains. The sterile scent of the hospital room was softened by the delicate floral arrangements that James had insisted on having delivered to her room earlier that day, their fresh, subtle fragrance lingering in the air. Sophie's heart was still racing from the intensity of the past few hours, but the exhaustion was eclipsed by the overwhelming wave of love and warmth that washed over her as she watched James cradling their newborn son in his arms. He sat beside her bed, his dark hair slightly disheveled, the first buttons of his crisp white shirt undone as though he had dressed hastily in his urgency to be by her side. His broad shoulders were tense, and yet his expression was soft, unbearably soft, as he gazed down at the fragile bundle in his arms. Their baby boy was wrapped snugly in a pale blue blanket, his tiny features barely visible beneath the edge of the soft fabric. James's large hand dwarfed the infant's delicate body as he held him with such careful precision, as though he feared the slightest movement would break the precious miracle he now held. Sophie's eyes burned with tears as she watched James lower his head, brushing his lips against the soft down of their son's hair. "He's perfect," James whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "So perfect." Sophie smiled, her heart swelling painfully in her chest. "He looks like you," she whispered, her voice soft and tender. James's gaze lifted, his dark blue eyes glinting with moisture as he turned toward her. A quiet, trembling smile pulled at his lips. "No," he said softly, shaking his head. "He has your mouth, your delicate nose, and he already has your heart." Sophie's throat tightened as James's hand brushed along the curve of their son's cheek with infinite tenderness. "He's ours," James whispered. "Our son." Sophie's breath hitched as she felt the weight of their child resting against her chest, his warmth seeping into her skin as his tiny mouth opened and closed with quiet breaths. Her lips trembled as she brushed a soft kiss against his forehead, her heart tightening with a fierce wave of protectiveness and devotion. James's hand slid beneath hers, steadying her hold on their son. His thumb brushed over the back of her hand as he leaned in closer, his breath ghosting over her temple as he whispered, "You've given me more than I ever dreamed of." Sophie's heart swelled painfully as her eyes lifted toward his. Tears glistened beneath her lashes as James's gaze darkened with quiet emotion. "I never thought." James's voice faltered, his jaw tightening as he swallowed hard. "I never thought I would deserve this you." Him. Sophie's lips parted as James's hand slid beneath her chin, tilting her face toward his. His thumb brushed along the curve of her jaw with quiet reverence. "You changed everything for me," James whispered. "You made me believe in love again. You made me whole." Sophie's breath hitched as James's mouth brushed softly over hers. His lips trembled against hers as his hand cradled the back of her neck. "Thank you," James whispered brokenly, "for giving me a family, for giving me everything." Sophie's chest squeezed painfully as her arms tightened around their son. "You've given me everything too," she whispered. "Your love, your heart. I wouldn't be here without you, James." James's breath hitched as his forehead pressed against hers. "You're my everything," he murmured. Sophie's lips trembled as James's hand slid over the curve of her cheek. "I love you, Sophie," he said. Sophie smiled softly as her hand curled around his wrist. "I love you too." James's eyes softened as his hand slid over their baby's back. Their son stirred slightly, a soft whimper escaping his lips as James's hand soothed along his tiny body. Sophie's heart melted at the tender sight of James, holding their child so carefully, his protective instincts already so deeply ingrained. "He's going to be strong," James said softly, his gaze darkening with quiet pride. "Just like you." Sophie smiled as her hand brushed over the soft down of their baby's hair. "And he's going to have your heart," she whispered. James's eyes softened as his arm curled around Sophie's shoulders, drawing her closer as their baby nestled between them. The quiet hum of the hospital monitors faded into the background as James's hand slid beneath her chin, his lips pressing softly against her forehead. "We're a family now," James whispered. Sophie's heart swelled painfully as her head rested against his shoulder. "Yes," she breathed. "A family." James's lips curled faintly as his hand slid over the back of her head, his fingers weaving gently into her hair. "I promise I'll protect you both," he whispered. "I'll give you everything you need, everything you want, always." Sophie's eyes burned with tears as her fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt. "You already have," she whispered. "You've already given us everything." James's hand slid over her back as his lips brushed softly over her temple. "And I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you know it," he whispered. Sophie's heart melted as James's gaze lowered toward their baby. Their son's tiny hand curled instinctively around James's finger, and James's breath trembled as he kissed the top of his son's head. "You're my greatest gift," James whispered. "Both of you." Sophie's heart raced as James's gaze lifted toward hers, dark and tender, with quiet intensity. "I love you, Sophie," he said softly. Sophie's smile trembled as her hand slid over his cheek. "I love you too," she whispered. James's eyes softened as he leaned in, pressing his mouth against hers in a deep, lingering kiss. The sound of their baby's soft breathing filled the room as James's arm curled protectively around Sophie's waist, and as Sophie rested her head against his shoulder, their son nestled peacefully between them. She knew with quiet certainty that this was the beginning of a lifetime filled with love, devotion, and quiet joy.